Praise the Lord for that. You know, and as bad as 9 is, 10's great. I mean, 11, as bad as 9 and 10 are, 11's great. So, but it's a shift. You know, 11's a shift. And really, it really makes you really start to think about that predestination idea when you get to 11, because you deal with that in 9 and 10 about how God had his hand, and God can make one vessel for refuge and another for honor, and God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and we go through all that stuff, and you're like, man, that sounds real predestinationalist, right? And we spend a lot of time on that. But it's really funny how it shifts in 11, and we start talking about how people made choices that affected their relationship with God. And it's these free will choices. And so it really stands in contrast. And it really puts the perspective on the book to say, okay, now we got these people that are doing these things, that are making these wonderful choices that have changed God, changed how we see God, and have changed the course of history, and it's just an amazing idea. We portrayed God, Christ, as this high priest, this great high priest. We portrayed him as this king. We portrayed him in all these wonderful ways, and now we're getting down to this crux of 11 in Hebrews, and this household of faith that we call it. And it's one of those places in the Bible, and there's a lot of people named here, and things that I struggle with some of these people, what they did, what they didn't do. But the Hebrew writer's holding all these people up as an example to you and me of what a life can do and what we can do with decisions we make and things that we pursue. And, people say, well, one person can't make a difference. Well, God's all about one person can make all the difference, So whenever we really tell ourselves that, well, I can't make a difference. One person can't make a difference. I might not make a difference in the world. I might not make a difference in the United States. But I promise you, I can make a difference in my church. I can make a difference in my family. I can make a difference in the people that I'm close to. I promise you, and you can too. And that's something that you and I, as Christians, we have a responsibility to make good decisions, don't we? To live by faith. And that's a big task. We start Hebrews 11 with that idea, right? The definition of faith. And it depends on the translation you read here. In New American Standard, faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. And that's probably pretty good. That's probably a pretty good translation. Does somebody have that in King James or Young's Literal? Or?
And faith is of things hoped for, confidence of matters not seen, a conviction. Young's Literal.
A confidence and a conviction, or an evidence. A lot of translation, like King James says, it's evidence of things hoped for, right? It's evidence. And I think in the original language, that idea of confidence really stands out. Faith is a confidence. It's not, when we have faith in Scripture, faith in God, it's a confidence that we believe that God is going to do what God says he's going to do. Now, I think that's a step away from saying, this idea of blind faith, or this idea of, faith in what Rex wants, or faith in what Rex desires, But to have the faith that God is going to do what God does if we do what we do, And I think that's really an impressive thought, isn't it? Being sure of what we hope for, sure of it. In other words, our faith is not based on nothing. It's not based on emptiness. It's not based on just a dream or a fairy tale. It's being sure of it, right? And certain of what we do see. This idea of confidence in what we see, and that's the original language. To be confident. And that's what you and I have to do. And as he holds up these people in the Bible in Hebrews 11, as he holds these people up, he's holding them up to this ideal that these people, through faith, they did things and pursued things that they would never see in their lifetime, the entirety of what they did. And that's impressive, isn't it? I always say, well, we plant trees we're never going to sit in the shade of, right? You ever heard that? We plant trees we're never going to sit in the shade of. That's what we're supposed to do with our lives. And these are people that did that. The idea of the Hebrew writer, when he starts in this, he says, we understand the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. That's the first part of faith that the Hebrew writer puts on the plate. He says we have to understand, we have faith. Why do we have that? Because it's common sense, right? I mean, there's stuff here, right? And you and I, we make stuff from stuff, right? We make stuff from stuff. But at some point, you got to say, who made the stuff? Right? I mean, it's just logical, isn't it? It's kind of like that idea that even if by some, what do they call this, theory of mass numbers or whatever, this idea that if you do something enough, like a billion, zillion, quadzillion times, eventually it's supposed to work. And I just don't believe that, I mean, it's like taking a watch apart and putting it in a Ziploc bag and shaking it and wanting it to be a watch. I think you could shake it 5 trillion times. It still wouldn't be a watch, right? It'd just be a bunch of parts,
Yeah, this gives us an indication it's more than just set in order things that were there.
Right.
This gives us that he actually created.
It's really a step beyond what Genesis tells us, which we're not going to get into that. We're going to do Genesis next, I've decided, but it's really a step beyond what even Genesis says, because Genesis really doesn't talk so much about the forming out of nothingness as it does about the ordering of what was formed. And here, the Hebrew writer steps before that and makes this idea that God created what's here, that God's a creator God. And that's such a big thing. But it's so true. It has to be so true. Nothing can come from nothing. It just can't. But yet we're here. And that's just a logical conclusion. And even a scientist today, now we teach intelligent design because scientists have finally come to the conclusion, right? After all these years of Darwinism and evolution and all these other things, scientists have finally come to the conclusion that guess what? It still doesn't explain why there's anything here, right? I mean, if there was a big bang, somebody had to make it go bang. Somebody had to say bang, right? Bang, here it is, right? And they finally have come to that conclusion. It's really funny when you read Strobel's book about that, Case for Christ, and he goes to university, and he goes to university to talk about creation. And he, I guess it's Case for Creation. He's wrote so many books, can't keep it straight, but I think it's Case for Creation. And so he goes to university to talk about creation. He goes to the science department. And they said, well, you need to go to the philosophy department because the scientists have decided there has to be a creator. so it's one of those things, right? Not call him God, but we got to have a creator. And so it's this amazing start to this idea. That is hard to see. In this passage, we're going to talk about a bunch of different people. And all these people are people who the Hebrew writer holds up to us as examples of faith, and examples of not just faith, but examples of faith in action. And I think that's impressive. I should have made that a better slide. Apologize. But all these people we're going to talk about, right? All these, maybe they're not all heroes, but they are heroes in Hebrews. They're heroes in God's eyes. Doesn't mean they're all perfect. Matter of fact, there's some really imperfect people on this list. Really imperfect people, right? I mean, let's face it. Rahab was a harlot, right? And yet here she is, right? You know, Barak, he wouldn't go to battle without Deborah by his side. He was scared to go. Said, I won't go unless Deborah goes, right? You know, but here he is, right? In the household of faith. Samson, well, you know all the trouble he had. Jephthah is the one who vowed the first thing that came out of the door of his house, and it was his daughter, right? Jephthah. You know, David had his great sin with Bathsheba, right? You know, These aren't perfect people, just like we're not perfect people. Now, there's a couple of them on here that are pretty close. All right, I'll give you that. Joshua, Joshua was one guy in the Bible, just really didn't ever do anything wrong. I mean, he was just pretty much, he was a good guy, wasn't he? I mean, he led the children, right? Said they could take the land, right? God spared him through the wilderness, took the children of Israel over the Jordan River, drove out the nations before him, made that powerful statement in Joshua that says, choose today who you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Joshua was a good guy. Samuel was a good guy. Had bad kids, but he was a good guy, right? So there's a lot of people on here. And we're going to talk a little bit about all these people. Were there more people than that he could have brought up? Sure. Absolutely. There's a lot more people here that he could have brought up and put on this list. But these are the ones that he chose, the Hebrew writer chose to put on it. And so when we move into that, he begins with Abel. Abel, and this is where, we always wonder, right? Because when you read it in Genesis, it just basically says they both made an offering, right? And God didn't like Cain's, and God was pleased with Abel's. And so Cain slew Abel, and Abel's blood cried from the ground. And it never really says why God didn't like that offering. And everybody speculates. Well, it's because it wasn't a blood offering, because it was a grain offering. Well, that's, that maybe not. Because they did grain offerings too. God wanted the first fruits. One was a farmer, one was a herdsman, the best of what they had. So I don't know that that's what it is. And so we kind of wonder, well, why did God reject the offering of Cain? And the Hebrew writer says it was because that by faith, Abel brought a better offering than Cain did. Now, I don't know if it's because it was blood and grain or because it was just better. But the Hebrew writer says is that by faith, he did it. By faith, Abel brought a better offering. And so he gives us a little hint into what was going on. Why was God pleased with Abel's offering? And it comes down to faith. And so it's really kind of interesting that he puts that in there on Abel, because if we think about Abel for a minute, Abel lived at a time when there were patriarchs, when God was talking to man, God was walking with Adam, God kicked him out of the garden. He was like he was a generation away from the garden, right? I mean, he's a generation away from the Garden of Eden. And so, it's kind of interesting, these offerings and what's going on, but, did he have more faith? Did he bring the better part because he had faith God would reward him for it? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that question, but it kind of gives you a little hint into, what went on. And, if you believe that God's going to give you a blessing for your sacrifice, which that's how that worked in the Old Testament, and you really believe it, then you're going to have faith. Your confidence is going to say, I'm going to give God the best offering I can give him because he's going to give me the best return back, right? But if you don't have the faith to say, well, maybe God won't give me the best, so, I'll just give him this, and I'll just hope it's all right, right? And God, your faith isn't there, is it? Because you don't believe that if you gave him the best, he's going to give you the best back. So maybe that's it. I don't know. But it says he was commended as righteous. When God spoke well of his offering, and by faith, Abel still speaks even though he is dead. All these people died, didn't they? Everybody on this list has been dead for centuries. All these people died. And yet we still listen to their story. We still listen to what they had to say. It's impressive, isn't it? I've always wondered if we could go back to these Bible characters and said, 10,000 years, people are still going to be talking about you. They'd go, man, I better really do good. Right? Because, thousands of years, we're still talking about these people and what they did. And Abel died, right? Abel was the righteous one. Abel was the one who did the right thing. And yet Abel died. You ever kind of wonder about that? You know, he was the good one, right? Wasn't he the good one? You know, he did what God wanted him to do. And God didn't spare him, did he? He's dead, but he still speaks. You see, it kind of gives you a lesson about God, doesn't it? We're way more worried about our time here than God is. You believe that? We're way more worried about it than God is. Because God is eternal, and God knows in the scope of eternity what's 60 or 70 or 100 years to God. Difference is it? What difference is it to God between 20 years and 80 years in the scope of eternity? It's not anything. We're way more worried about it than God is. I always hear people say that, well, how could God just wipe out whole children and everything? I said, God wasn't worried about them children. You know, God knew them children was all right. Right? I guess so. Yeah, for one of them, 33 years was a lot, wasn't it? Enoch was transliterated, we say. Two people in the Bible that were transliterated, right? Enoch and Elijah. And Enoch never tasted death. The Hebrew writer says he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. But before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. You can find that in Genesis 5, 21 through 25. Enoch was transliterated. God took him up. Only two people in the Bible that happened to. It's kind of really fascinating from a theological view. This whole idea of transliterating to God is really, really kind of hard to wrap our head around. But it's an interesting, and so Enoch is held up. Enoch. And then he kind of pulls back and he says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. And if you're a highlighter person in your Bible, Hebrews 11:6 is definitely a highlight passage of the Bible. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. You know, faith is part of our walk as a Christian. And without faith, we cannot please God. We just can't. We have to have faith. We have to have faith that he exists, right, and that he rewards. That's our confidence. And if we don't have that, then God will not be pleased with us. Faith is part of who we are, the confidence of who we are as Christians. By faith, Noah, you know, was there a better example of faith in the whole Bible than Noah, really? I mean, was there anybody better than Noah when it comes to faith? I mean, this guy literally built a boat when it never rained, you know? I mean, I mean, that's a lot. You know what I'm saying? I mean, and it wasn't just a little boat, you know? I mean, this thing took him years, right? And don't you know, the whole time people were laughing at him and wagging their fingers and saying, that old crazy Noah, right? They'd probably walk by that thing every day going, that old crazy Noah, right? Out there building a boat in the middle of nowhere, right? And, you know, I've always thought about Noah and God, and there's so many lessons in Noah. You know, in 1 Peter 3, where it says, you know, that the water saved 8, right? Noah prepared an ark, and 8 were saved, brought through the water, right? Baptism, that doth not also save you. You know, the water didn't save him, did it? Did the water save Noah? Obedience saved Noah, didn't it? I mean, if Noah hadn't built that boat, that ark, then he would have drowned like everybody else, right? And that's exactly what Peter's saying in 1 Peter 3. He's not saying the water saved Noah. He's saying the obedience to what God told Noah to do saved Noah. Everybody in this story, well, I take exception with Sarah, but we'll get to her in a minute. But everybody else in this story, They did things by faith that they wouldn't have done without it. And I think that's the mark of greatness when it comes to God. I really have come to that conclusion in my life. Greatness with God is about what we do because we are Christian, because we have faith. If you could put everything in your life to the side that you do, because that's something I really, I say that from the pulpit a lot, but it's because I think about it all the time. At the end of my day, I say, what did I do today that without God I wouldn't have done it? What can I hold up to God today in my life? This day, just this day, what can I hold up to God and say, I did this today because I have faith in you. Without you, I would not have done this today. Some days I don't have anything to hold up. Because some days I just do my day, right? And I don't have anything to hold up and say, I did this today. Don't you think as Christians, huh? No, I'm not saying I sinned. I'm just saying, what did you do in your life? Because this is how I see it. I can't speak for you. I can only speak for me. But I think I'm a pretty good guy. I'm not trying to hold myself up or tote no horns, but I don't think I'm a person that would go kill people, right? I don't think I'm going to go rob anybody. I don't think I'm going to go steal anything that I know of. I don't think I'm going to lie, too much anyway, right? I don't think that I'm just being honest here, right? I think if I wasn't a Christian, I would still be a decent human being. That's what I'm trying to say. I think even if I wasn't a Christian, I would still be a decent human being. I do. I'd be a good neighbor. I think I'd be a decent husband, maybe not a good husband, but I'd be decent. I'd be a decent father, maybe not a great father, but a decent father, even if I wasn't a Christian. So at some point in the last several years, I sat down and I said, well, Rex, how are you different because you're a Christian? Right? How are you different because you're a Christian? What about you is different because you have a relationship with God? I think it's really easy for us to say, well, I have a relationship with God and I try to live a good life and I don't cheat or don't steal. But would you do that anyway? That's my question. Would you do that anyway? Even if you weren't a Christian? Do you think you would be a thief do you think you would be? And just answer that question honestly in your mind. Do you think you would be a good person even if you weren't a Christian? So at some point you have to step back and say, what about me being a Christian makes me different, my nature different than what it would have been anyway? You see? Or that's what I think. Now y'all might disagree with that. Well, I know that's part of it, but I'm saying, but you have to back up and say that. How many people have I led to Christ? How many times have I shared the gospel? How many times have I done something, stepped out of my comfort zone and done something for God that without God I wouldn't have done it anyway? Right? And I think that's a big question for a Christian to ask. I think it is. You might not think it is. I'm not saying you have to ask this in your own life. I'm saying this is how Rex asked. This is the question Rex asked Rex, right? Because at the end of the day, I have to know that. Because at some point, God's going to stand me up before the judgment and he's going to review my life. Right? Isn't that what the Bible says? He's going to review my life. And when he reviews that, is he going to say, well, Rex, you're a pretty good guy. But you'd have been a pretty good guy anyway. What were you because of me? You see? Well, I'm just saying that's what I ask myself. I'm not saying you have to ask yourself this question. I'm just saying that's what I ask myself. Because I think it's important. Because the people in this story, because this is a story in Hebrews 11. It's a story of people who changed the world. Right? Because of these people, you and I are sitting here today. They changed your life. These people changed your life, even though they lived thousands of years ago. These people changed your life today. Because they did something in their life that without God, they wouldn't have done it. And to me, that gives me chills up and down my arms. Because Noah would have never built that ark if God hadn't said, Noah, build an ark. Right? But he did. God said, go for wood, and so Noah did. Right? And the truth is here is that he saved his family, but he saved us. Didn't he? Didn't Noah save us? Yeah. I do, Billy, but you know, God does speak to me. I mean, I know what you're saying. I mean, if God showed up, I know what you're saying. If God showed up in person and said, you need to do this, I think you would do it. I think any of us here would do it. All right, go ahead. Right. Yeah, I mean, they did. They rejected Christ. And that's what he said. You know, even if one comes back from the dead, they won't believe, you know, and it's true. But I just think Noah is one of those guys that he's just something special, you know. It's interesting in that Hebrew, he says, by faith he condemned the world. And I never agreed with that. I know you say, well, I shouldn't disagree with the Bible, but he became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. The world was condemned, but Noah didn't shut the door. And I always think, you know, Theon Radable, I always remember Theon when I talk about Noah, because Theon always said, I bet there was a lot of people with splinters under their fingernails, you know, trying to get in the ark. And I imagine, and that's sad, isn't it? Wouldn't that be heart-wrenching? I mean, even if they didn't believe you, even if they mocked you and scorned you and told you was an idiot, on the day they were drowning, you would want to throw down a life vest. I would, wouldn't you? But that's not how this works. So Noah becomes this pinnacle of faith. Abraham is a different story, isn't he? Abraham was called to go to a place he would later receive as an inheritance. He obeyed and went. But Abraham had issues, right? Abraham 2 times tried to pass his wife off as a sister, which she kind of was, right? And, well, actually she was a sister, but 2 times he tried to pass her off, right? You know, Abraham was a great man in great faith. But Abraham, to me, he wasn't as, I don't know, shouldn't say it that way, but God said, leave your family and everything and go to the land that I'll show you, and he took Lot. And boy, Lot was a problem. You know, Lot was a problem from the beginning, right? I mean, at some point when Abraham was like 4 days out, he should have said, Lot, go home. I'm not going to put up with you anymore, right? Because Lot was a problem. You know, and Lot cost him a lot, right? And so Lot, and the other thing was, like I said, he tried to pass his wife off as a sister a couple times. He tried to circumvent God when he had Ishmael. When Ishmael was born with Hagar. But on the other hand, he did so many great things, right? He left that land. He went where God told him to go. He gave Lot the choice. He went to sacrifice Isaac on the altar. You know, and so he's here because he should be here. But by faith, he made his home. Yeah, go ahead. It does, for sure. Faith is something that grows throughout our life as a Christian, or it should. We should have more faith at the end of our life than we had at the beginning, and I think that's true.
You know, when Billy said, well, yeah, God told you face to face, but then in Cain and Abel, I imagine God told Cain and Abel the same thing. And that story may be, no matter what God tells you, you have a choice. And some don't pick the right choice. Cain certainly didn't, even though he had the same opportunity that Abel had.
Right. Well, we all have choices. Like I said, Hebrews 11 is all about choices. Choices people make. Choices to do good, choices to do bad, choices to obey God, not to obey God. Decisions, right? Decisions we all make every day, you know.
Some of them talked to God, some of them seen Jesus, some of them had faith and was rewarded for it. But what does he tell us? We haven't seen and we have faith. How much greater is that?
Right.
I mean, I think there's something to be said there.
Not everybody in this story God talked to directly.
No.
Not everybody in this list God talked to. I mean, there's no indication God ever talked to Rahab. You know, a lot of people in this list are people God didn't necessarily talk to. You know, God never, as far as we know, God never talked to Samson. I mean, he got the Spirit, but I don't think God ever spoke to him, you know. So there's a lot of different stories here. Abraham was a guy that God spoke to. God told Abraham, take your son, sacrifice him on an altar. Man, I don't know if God told me that, Billy. God told me to take my child and lay him on an altar and slit his throat. That's a lot. I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's a lot. That's a big thing. That's a big thing to ask, to give your child. But Abraham, in this story, he kind of tells us why Abraham did that, why Abraham made that choice to obey what God told him to do, even though it seemed like the worst thing ever that God's ever asked anybody to do. Yeah. He had faith he would see him again. I don't know, Abraham did a lot of things, but Isaac on the altar was, maybe the biggest thing. He made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as is Isaac and Jacob, who are with him with the same promise. He was looking forward to a city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. It's interesting how the Hebrew writer starts to put these people centuries before Jesus ever came, centuries before we ever talked about heaven or a new Jerusalem. These people, according to the Hebrew writer, were looking for this building, looking for this eternity, looking towards more than what was here. Sarah is one that I struggle with. I'll tell you, of all the people on this list, I struggle more with Sarah than anybody. When God said that, Sarah, you're going to have a child, what did she do? She laughed, right? And God struck her dumb, right? Well, she couldn't speak. She might have already been dumb, I don't know. but God made her where she couldn't speak, right? But here she is. Because why? Because she had Isaac. And Isaac was the child of promise.
She looks like she didn't trust God to me, though.
Well, I know, I agree. Yeah, go ahead. Right. And traditionally, we're about out of time, but traditionally, the Jews had this sort of oral tradition and folklore tradition that was handed down, the Mishnah and other things. And it kind of sometimes painted a little broader picture of these people than what you get in Scripture. So there's a little bit of folklore basis to some of these people, what they did, what they didn't do, that was kind of handed down. And the guy that wrote Hebrews was aware of those things. So that's one thing. You kind of get a little bit of that interjection in Hebrews 11. So anyway, we're out of time. Thanks for being here tonight. Hope that we had a good time.